Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a fantastic day as usual. Today, we're going to do an assortment of creepy stalker stories, and I hope you enjoy them. And if you do, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It helps me out and it helps the channel out. We've grown astronomically from where we were, even just in the past few weeks. It's slow and steady, but it's still fantastic, and I appreciate all the support that everybody gives to the channel. But without further ado, I hope you enjoy listening to today's stories as much as I did reading them. It's been about 10 years since this happened, but I still remember things pretty clear. I should note that this is told from my perspective, and I wish I could get my mother's perspective on it as well. She just doesn't remember the events as well as I do. For context, I lived in a mid-sized city in the southern United States, where the main things to do at the time were to go to the mall. Sure, we had movie theaters and a couple of bowling alleys, but besides that, there really wasn't much to do in that city. My mom worked at a department store located in the mall. Having nothing better to do, I would regularly go and sit in the break room while she worked. It gave me a reason to get out of the house, and if I wanted to, I was allowed to walk around the mall or get something to snack on in the food court. Honestly, though, I was shy and I preferred to just stay cooped up in the break room, playing video games on my Nintendo 3DS. My mom's co-workers were generally very sweet to me and frequently popped in to say hello or just to check on me during downtime. If I was lucky enough to go with my mom on weekends, I could usually convince my mom to pick up my friend. We were actually dating, but since we were both girls, I didn't want that to get out. To go along with us, going to the mall meant I was free from doing chores at home, and it was a cheap way to sneak a secret date in every now and then. My girlfriend, though, never really liked staying in the break room with me. She always wanted to walk around the mall. I should note that she really enjoyed taking walks, so it wasn't out of the ordinary to want to do so at the mall as well. I just didn't like walking as much as she did, so I tried to weasel my way out of it whenever I could. I could usually convince her to just walk over to a nearby store and look around, or to go grab something from the food court rather than walking. But I noticed pretty quickly that she wasn't trying to actually get me to walk around. She just didn't want to be in the break room. Now, my girlfriend was more perceptive to things than I was, and I assumed she just didn't like the ambiance of the break room for some reason. For a little while, I let it go, but eventually I got frustrated and asked directly what was really bothering her about that break room. I thought she was going to tell me that it was too cramped or the lights randomly cutting off made her uneasy. The things that bothered me about it too. But no, what she told me was that she heard things in the ceiling, like something was walking around up there. I had learned from my mother that there was a room in the ceiling, but it wasn't for walking around, it was for maintenance. Most of the stuff in there was wiring and insulation, but technically someone could go up there. So I told my girlfriend this, and said it was likely an employee up there to fix stuff. She said that that was fine, but she didn't really like it and still preferred walking around or sitting in the food court. I understand her discomfort and I just wanted to help, so I agreed. We had a really good relationship in the sense of communication, and though I did get frustrated, I wanted to make sure she felt comfortable. Later that day, I mentioned what my girlfriend had told me and asked what they were fixing in the ceiling, though my mom just looked distressed and said they hadn't been up there fixing anything that day. But she wanted me to see something. My mom took me into the receiving room of the department store, which was just a room off in the back filled with boxes and random junk the store was going to put out for sale. The layout of this room, though, was sort of an L shape. One part of the L was used for receiving, but the other part was the way into the ceiling. I should clarify for this next part that to get into the ceiling, the store would have to call for the mall's maintenance team. They didn't have a ladder or anything on hand to climb in there, as it would have been a safety hazard. The only thing that this particular area had was a hatch that led into the ceiling. That was it. So, needless to say, I was horrified to see what appeared to be claw marks leading up the wall to the hatch. I still remember the way they looked. Brown gashes that had been dug into the concrete wall of the receiving room. I asked my mom if it was a prank, but she told me that this wasn't the first time it had happened, and she had no way of knowing I would have even asked about it. According to her, these weird carvings had shown up several times over the course of a few months. Each time, the store would call in the mall's security and maintenance teams, who would clean the wall up and then go into the ceiling to investigate. Nothing had ever come out of their searches, and eventually they just gave up on dealing with the marks. The only explanation mall security could give us was that this was likely a homeless individual who had made their way into the ceiling by sheer willpower. It happened to be very good at hiding during the searches. I stopped staying at the mall with my mom after that, and anytime I wanted my girlfriend to come over, we found somewhere else to go during the day. Sometimes she'd just come over to my house and we'd watch TV or whatever. But I didn't feel safe going back to the break room after that. I knew nothing that had happened up until that point, but I just didn't want to risk it, honestly. So, to whoever or whatever was walking around in that ceiling at my mom's workplace, let's never meet. I normally take a walk every Friday to attend my weekly classes. It's a 15-minute power walk from my apartment in a relatively safe city from Eastern Europe. I've never ever felt unsafe in my city, and I wouldn't normally exercise caution when walking alone at night. Tonight, however, after the end of class, I began my usual walk back home, and 5 minutes in, and a lot of corner cutting and alley shortcuts, I noticed that this strange-looking man is still following me. The first glimpse I got of him at this point was a young man in his 20s. Incel-looking, hat on, shiny, elegant shoes on, and a black coat. On a closer look, he had a link chain. The kind of chain you use in heavy transportation and to pull heavy loads, around his neck. I instantly got shivers down my spine and changed my pace of walking to very slow, then very fast to check if he does too. He changed his as well, and I could see from the corner of my eye he was still behind me. He was also on the phone, and I got the feeling he was taking pictures of me. At this point, I completely freaked out, but my first thought was that I was athletic enough to put up with this creep, and that I needed to stay focused. I was on the main boulevard parallel from my apartment, and I decided to turn right in a very fast and abrupt way. He kept on walking, and I thought I was just crazy, and it was all in my head. But 2 minutes later, he was still behind me. I must mention that there were people on the street at every corner, so even if he wanted to attempt something, it would have been virtually impossible. When I reached my apartment, I entered the house very quick, checked if he wasn't behind me, and that was it. However, the scary part comes now. After an hour or so, my husband checked our building security camera and saw that I rushed into the flat. This creep hid behind a car and stayed there for a good 15 minutes watching the building. Afterwards, he approached the entrance and took a picture of the entrance and the address engraved on it. I am now scared. He will start stalking me and my family. When I was 18 and newly graduated, I ran into some issues with my attempts to enroll in college, and also had a hard time finding a job in my area in the meantime, which led to me having to sign on at the job center. They determined that I was too shy to succeed in interviews and placed me in a group that was supposed to teach interview skills in order to fix that. The group ended up ultimately being a complete waste of time. I honestly think they put me in the wrong group, or it just needed an extra member and made an excuse to throw me in to make up the numbers, but that's not really relevant to this story. And the other group members didn't do much to help with my shyness either, since they were all men who at least 4 decades older than me, and obviously didn't share any of my interests. Unfortunately, I ended up gaining the attention of one member I wanted nothing to do with. I don't actually remember the man's name at this point, but I think it was something generic like John, so that's what I'll call him. John immediately got off on the wrong foot with the rest of the group when he interrupted the instructor during their introduction to the course to complain that him being there was useless, since he would be retiring in a few years anyway, and no one wanted to hire someone who had spent over 10 years in prison. When that didn't get him the reaction he wanted, I assumed the rest of the group thought he was just attention seeking, and the instructor had heard similar things before from people who weren't happy about being in the course. He waited until we had been given paperwork to complete, and then turned to the man next to him and loudly explained his prison sentence. It was for beating his ex-wife, but that she was a lying bitch and he never put a hand on her. She didn't even have any bruises on her at the trial, or any evidence of bruises or injuries before that either. But because she was a woman, the judge automatically believed her and sent him to jail. This immediately sent me on edge. I'm not an expert when it comes to the law, but I do watch true crime channels on YouTube, and I have never heard of a sentence of over 10 years for a single beating that supposedly never even happened, or that there weren't even any visible injuries to begin with. Either John was lying and had severely beaten his wife to the point of putting her in the hospital, or he had been arrested on other charges and was covering up what he actually went to prison for. I immediately decided I wanted nothing to do with him regardless of which one it was, and I would avoid interacting with him as much as possible, unless I absolutely had to, or if I was passing him things that I was asked to. Like I said before, I didn't really interact much with the other members of the group at all because of their ages. I attended the first half of the meeting in the morning, spent the dinner break in the library while the men all snuck off to the pub, and then went home immediately after the second half was over. No one ever asked me how I had spent my breaks, and since the pub and library were in opposite directions from each other, and they couldn't be seen from the front of the building the group met in because of the way the streets were arranged, there should have been no way for any of them to know where I had been, which made what happened next even more worrying. About halfway through the course, there was a day where I had bumped into a friend on my dinner break and decided to put off visiting the library until the course was over for the day, just to catch up with them instead. When I did get around to it, I spent at least a quarter of an hour there before heading to the desk to check out my books, and ended up being drawn into a conversation by the librarian, who had noticed I was checking out books related to a franchise he also enjoyed, and that it was getting a new movie the next year. There were only a handful of other people in the library, so I didn't see anything wrong with talking to a friendly man around my age who shared my interests after 8 hours of boredom and paperwork. We had been talking for another quarter of an hour when he suddenly glanced over my shoulder, looking confused and concerned, and was just opening his mouth to say something when someone grabbed me by my shoulders. My friends and family know that I hate having my shoulders touched without warning and would never have done that to me. So I immediately knew that whoever was touching me was a stranger and knocked their hands away while turning around and backing up into the librarian's desk. It was John. He was standing directly behind me with a huge smile on his face, and as soon as I turned around, he made a joke about knowing he would find me there and how I practically lived there before, talking to me as if we were close friends. I was just completely confused. It was obvious that he hadn't just coincidentally bumped into me from the way he was talking, but John had been kept behind while the group was heading out because he had filled out his paperwork incorrectly. And as I mentioned before, you can't see the library from the building, so he shouldn't have had any way of seeing where I had gone. It had also been half an hour since I had left that building, so if he had left not long ago after me and just seen me go in while we were walking in the same direction, he would have had to come inside by then. The only way it made sense for him to know to look for me there and joke that I practically lived there would be if he had somehow learned I was going to the library during dinner breaks, known I hadn't that day and guessed I would go after the meeting instead. What made that even stranger than it already was is the fact that John had never shown any interest in me during the group sessions, and mostly ignored me the way I ignored him, unless we were forced to interact for whatever reason. So, why was he now following me into the other building to start conversations out of nowhere and acting like we were close? While John was still talking, the librarian leaned in to ask if I knew the man because he had obviously seen my negative reaction to being touched by John, and when I briefly explained the situation to him, he asked John politely to please leave me alone or leave the building. John refused and tried to tell the man that we were friends, completely ignoring the fact that I had just said we weren't, and how ridiculous it would be to claim an 18-year-old girl and a 50-something or 60-something-year-old man were friends in the first place. When the librarian asked again and outright told him that harassing other customers wasn't acceptable, and he would be removed from the building if he refused to leave me alone, John smiled and agreed to leave in a tone that you use when humoring a child before walking out, and very obviously stationing himself right outside the doors, waiting for me to leave too. The librarian was clearly concerned by this and asked for the full story of what was going on, and I told him, including my suspicions that John had been following me around without my knowledge to know I would be there in the first place. He suggested I should stay in the library until his break so he could walk me to my bus stop to make sure John left me alone, but it would be several hours, and if I had waited, I wouldn't have gotten home in time to change and head to another meeting I had later that evening. So he asked me to at least come in next time I was there to let him know if I was safe, and reluctantly watched me leave. John immediately stepped into my personal space when I got outside, jokingly asking what the librarian's problem was and still acting like we were friends. I tried to walk around him without answering him and head to the bus station to go home, but he grabbed me by my arm and reminded me that there was a closer stop for our bus. When I told him that we aren't getting on the same bus because I had never seen him on the same bus as me, he corrected me that we both needed the bus number and told me where he lived, which was in fact on the same bus route as me, although I was still tempted to just walk away and go to the station instead, and possibly sneakily get on a different bus and just walk the rest of the way home. It was very clear he was going to follow me if I did, because he still had a hold of my arm, refusing to let go when I tried to pull away. There were several dark alleys on the way that I had no intention of going anywhere near while in his company. When I agreed to go to the closer bus stop, he let go of me and started walking at my side, chattering like we were good friends again. John kept walking when we reached the stop, which was odd, but I was hoping that my lack of response to anything he said had made him give up and decide to leave me alone, or that he had mixed up that stop with one further along, and I could run while his back was turned. No luck. As soon as he realized I wasn't following him anymore, John came back, frowning as if he was confused, and asked me, "I thought we were going for coffee together." Shocked, I told him bluntly no. He kept pushing, trying to convince me that I had to agree to go with him, and when that didn't work, he switched tactics and claimed I had mentioned while leaving the classroom that I wanted some coffee, so he thought we could go together. That was an obvious lie, too, since I don't drink coffee and told him so. John's only answer was to say I didn't have to get coffee and kept pushing me to go to the cafe with him. I firmly told him no, and apparently he took that as me not wanting to drink in public because he attempted to invite me to his flat. If that wasn't weird enough, he started telling me that if there were a naked girl on the couch when we got there, I'm not to worry because that's his 18-year-old daughter. Because an 18-year-old is definitely going to lounge around naked on her father's furniture in front of him, right? Other people at the stop were staring at us now, and I took the opportunity to point out that I was also 18 and firmly tell John that I don't want to go to his flat with him and leave me alone. He completely ignored that last part and tried to claim I was lying about my age and was at least 29, when most people at the same time still mistook me for being in my early teens at first glance. The bus arrived at that moment and I got on as quickly as possible, thinking I would be safe there and the driver would throw him off if need be. No. When I sat in an aisle seat to stop John sitting next to me, he physically shoved me across the seat, pinning me in against the window to the point I could barely move, and pressing his knees up against the seat in front of him to make sure I had no room to get past him unless he allowed it. The only way for me to get out would have involved me straddling his lap since the seats in front of us were occupied. I'd loudly told him to move and to leave me alone, but he ignored me and continued trying to convince me to come to his flat. And although a few people gave me uncomfortable looks, when I tried to make eye contact with some of the men in the hopes they would help, they would look away as if they hadn't noticed or suddenly became very interested in their phones. I spent the ride huddled against the window trying to touch him as little as possible, and was ignored again when I shouted at him to stop touching me because he kept putting his hands on my thigh, as high up as he could get without directly groping me. No one did anything about it, but had stopped touching me after that. He had apparently also given up on convincing me to go to his flat that day, but when we were coming up to the apartment block, he pointed it out to me, physically turning my face when I refused to look, told me his apartment number and tried to give me a kiss goodbye on the cheek, when I dodged before getting off the bus and knocking on the opposite window to try to get my attention so he could wave at me. When the bus set off again, several people started loudly talking about how disgusting he was and that men like him should be reported, while refusing to look in the direction where I was sat, shaking and seething in my seat, and other than an awkward, so are you alright, from the driver just as I was about to step off of the bus, no one bothered to check on me. As soon as I got home, I sent an email to the instructor, telling her that I wanted to switch groups and never see that man again, explaining what he had done. She read it but ignored it for an entire week until I sent a follow-up, threatening to get the police involved if they forced me to interact with this man again, and their solution was to tell me I could leave the course early instead, essentially kicking me out as if I was the problem. I bumped into the man not long afterwards and he tried to ask me why I hadn't been attending the group anymore, admitting that he had asked the instructor and they had refused to tell him. I managed to get away and lose him in the crowd. I've seen him a few times in passing in the years since, but fortunately he has never noticed me or approached me again, and I hope it stays that way. Thank you everyone for listening. If your story was told, I'm glad I'm the one who could tell it. I appreciate all the love and support, and I hope you enjoyed today's stories as much as I did reading them. And please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It helps me and it helps the channel out.